Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Rahaf Al-Khazraji, a researcher and the deputy head of the publishing department at Trans Research and Advisory. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the second day of Trans' third annual Political Islam e-forum entitled Towards a Global Academic Dialogue on Political Islam. This forum aims to conduct a dialogue and come up with a set of conclusions and recommendations that can contribute to raising awareness of this phenomenon and the danger it poses to Arab and Western societies. This forum is a reflection of Trans Research and Advisory's strategy and its work in analyzing the trends and outcomes of political Islam regionally and globally. Tonight, we'll be discussing the non-Arab academia's vision of Islamism. Today's session aims to answer the following main question: why do many Western researchers sympathize with political Islam despite its clear danger to societies and national states, as explained yesterday by the lectures of the first session that discussed Arab academics' vision of this phenomenon. This session also aims to dismantle some of the stereotyped ideas that have become prevalent in many Western studies dealing with the phenomenon of political Islam by posing the following questions. First, can Islamism be consistent with the minimum standards of peaceful coexistence? And why does a group of Western researchers justify the violence practiced by these Islamist groups, in particular the Muslim Brotherhood? I will now open the floor to our distinguished speakers, who will each deliver a 10-minute overview of their perspectives, followed by an open discussion. Our first speaker is Dr. Raja Sakrani, Professor of Islamic Civilizations at the University of Munster, Germany. Please, Doctor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm based in Bonn, the University of Bonn, not in Münster. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm very glad to be with you here today. So comparing two non-Arab academic reflections on Islamism, such as the one in Germany and France, allows us, and this is my topic, allows us to grasp the dissemblance, even the theoretical and socio-cultural oppositions between two viscerally different discourses in Europe about Islamism. This will be the subject of my contribution to be published within the framework of this E-Symposium on non-Arab academia's vision of Islamism. Today, and given the time available to me, I will limit myself to the French case. France is not only the European country that hosts the two largest Islamic and Jewish communities in Europe, it is also the country that has been hit by a wave of terrorist attacks that have claimed hundreds of victims and provoked intense debates beyond the French borders. France has thus found itself more than any other European country called upon to make an intellectual effort to better understand Islamism. I would add in passing that France, because of its principe de la laïcité and the law of December 1905 on the separation of the churches and the state, arouses a specific discourse on religion at the political, academic, but also social and identitarian levels. Moreover, the controversy over Islamism that has arisen between two scholars, Gilles Capel and Olivier Roy, has generated a major debate not only in other European countries, Germany included, but also in the United States and the UK. From the outset, the two researchers differ in their view of Islam as religion, and I will come back to this. But they also differ in the status they give to ideology in explaining radicalization. At the same time, it should be recalled that their disciplinary inquiring in the fields of social sciences permits to intercept the internal vision that of epistemology, which consists in shifting the perspective from the traditional disciplines of Oriental studies to social sciences. The German academia on Islamism, on the other hand, although it is distant from Oriental studies with a colonial and even racist character, as is very dominant in France, remains very much encoded in what is called in German Islamwissenschaften. And this is, of course, we can make the link to the sympathy you mentioned, Rahaf, before, found more in Germany than in France with regard to Islamism. At this point, how not to recall that the man who issued in large part from the late 19th century European access to Islamic law is Ignaz Goldziher, the founder of modern Islamwissenschaft and the source on Islam to the famous German sociologist Max Weber. Capel gives a significant weight to the ideological factor and to the thesis of the radicalization of Islam as religion. Thus, the book Call for Global Islamic Resistance by Abu Mus'ab as-Suri would be, according to his expression, the instruction manual for terror attacks. Capel also believes that another book, Management of Savagery, Idarat At-Tawahush, written by Abu Bakr Naji, is fundamental to understanding the modus operandi of terrorism. He argues in his book La Fracture, published in 2016, that these books would be to the Islamist movement what Hitler's Mein Kampf and Lenin's What to Do were to Nazism and communism. The word is not explicitly dropped by Capel, but it is clearly an Islamic fascism or the fascist product of the Islamic religion. Focusing primarily on the radicalization of the individual and making a typology of the different generations of jihad, Gilles Capel situates himself within the micro theories on Islamism. This is why he believes that this ideological literature is characteristic of what he calls third generation terrorism, la troisième génération, a type of terrorism that differs from the first two periods. While the first wave was Afghan jihadism in the 80s, the September 11, 2001 attacks in New York and the Pentagon were apotheosis of second generation terrorism, a linear vertical terrorism. Third generation terrorism, on the other hand, would be proximity based and would operate in reticular manner. I quote, "This rhizome jihadism, consisting of going under the enemy's radar and turning its own adopted or natural children against it, is built in opposition to the centralist, almost Leninist model implemented by bin Laden," end of quote. The third generation terrorism is nourished, explains Capel in his book Terreur et Martyrs, relever le défi de la civilisation, from a critique of the counterproductive and harmful effects of September 11 attacks, notably because Afghanistan was attacked. It is this observation that would have led ideologists such as As-Suri and Zarqawi to change their strategy to abandon the pyramidal model characteristic of second generation for a reticular model based on the creation of, I quote, cells whose members welded together by the common planetary ideology of belief in jihad will be able to act autonomously by exercising so-called acts of terror of proximity. On his side, Olivier Roy inscribes his approach in the macro theory of analysis, since the emphasis is rather on the second generation youth, not as individuals, but as a group who are lost between two cultures, that of the Muslim parents and that of the global societies. For Roy, the problem is not a matter of radical Salafist texts, although he acknowledges the influence of radical ideologies. I quote, "The radicalization of Islam exists, Salafism exists, it is spreading among young people in Europe and in the Middle East, but I challenge the idea that Salafism is the gateway to terrorism," end of quote. In contrast to Capel's insisting on an ideology deeply rooted in the Islamic religion, Olivier Roy identifies in his book Le Jihad et la Mort, Jihad and Death, a different cause that is not of Islam as such, that is to say, as a religion, but a socio-cultural reason, since it is a kind of functional ideology, including numerous forms, and it is based on a passion for destruction, or what he calls une dimension mortifère. While Capel speaks of the radicalisation de l'islam, Roy insists on l'islamisation de la radicalité, Islamization of radicality. And Roy adds, in Islamism, religious considerations are only a facade that masks something deeper, a generational revolt, a revolt of sons against fathers that is by nature nihilistic. This is why, if Gilles Kepel speaks of an ideological and religious revolt, Roy speaks of a generational nihilism that has already existed in other forms in the past, in other cultures, and in relation to other religions. Islamism, in its violent form, is practiced in the name of Islam, but it is a kind of borrowing of circumstance without real adhesion on the part of the terrorists. The terrorist phenomena is nothing more than a transversal phenomena, neither horizontal nor vertical, as Capel claims. It crosses from one era to another according to structural modalities that are similar, whether it is Daesh or Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the mechanism is the same. Already in his famous book, Genealogy of Islamism, published in 1995, Olivier Roy develops the idea that, I quote, Islamic radicalism, which wants to translate the fundamentalistic message into political terms, can find an echo among an acculturated fringe of the Muslim population, which has become alienated from the culture of its parents, but is worried about the loss of identity that implies an overly successful integration. Later, in his reflections on the September 11 attacks, he reinforces his thesis that privileges identity crisis and frustration among Muslims over ideology. To attribute a causal importance to a certain Islamic literature advocating a radical ideology, according to Capel, is to sweep with the backhand the socio-cultural dimension of scientific analysis. Similarly, the establishment of questionable parallels with other non-Islamic radicalization phenomena and the denial of the power of ideological persuasion over the actors on the grounds that they are caught up in a timeless logic of rebellion that goes back to the Russian nihilists of the late 19th century, and this is, of course, Roy's thesis, is open to criticism. However, I would like to end by making the connection with the German academia. These two approaches to Islamism basically reveal two different approaches to Islam itself. In Germany, in addition to the approach of Islamic studies, the debate sparked by the late texts of Jürgen Habermas, especially on public space, paves the way for a different reflection on Islamism and on religions in general. Habermas, an infallible defender of the importance of a democratic debate open to otherness in the public space, was pushed to reframe his theory after the September 11 attacks by insisting on the place that the religion should be given in this same public sphere in what he called die postsäkulare Gesellschaft, post-secular society, a concept hardly inconceivable or conceivable in the sometimes radically secularized public places. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Doctor, for your enlightening presentation. I'll move to our second speaker, Ms. Sylvie Tausig, expert on political Islam. She's based in South America. Ms. Sylvie, please. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you a lot. It would have been necessary to begin by giving a quick description of what Islam is in Latin America, because for most people it is a totally unknown subject, but the time I have is very short. So the very important reality is that more than 50% of Muslims are actually converts, and mainly women. This fact colors local Islam in a very important way and explains why the main problematic of the academics was not the question of globalized Islam or the transnationalization of Islam, but mainly the articulation between being Muslim and, depending on the case, Mexican, Argentinian, etc. The researchers have not been interested in placing the deployment of Islam in Latin America in the context of its political revival, whether Shiite or Sunni, and the reform of Islamism. In some ways, it can be said that the study of Islamism has eluded Latino scholars completely. Indeed, in many cases, their work has been mainly anthropological, and the political or geopolitical dimension have escaped. The politically oriented dimension of Islamism is not ignored, but only by some foreign researchers. In fact, there are studies commissioned by American think tanks, mainly military and security, which provide a numerical description, precise and incomplete. These studies are or were accurate insofar as they had information on the different places of worship, but flawed insofar as they considered only one form of Islam violent and considered it only as a potential danger. There are also articles on the triple border, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, that suggest that there is threatening Islamist activities, the same for the Mexican borders and Colombia. So we have a contrast between, on the one hand, an academic work that focuses on anthropological themes and has no reflection on Islamism, and on the other hand, the work of governmental security and military agencies, think tanks that are not directly academic, that work on the dimensions of terrorism, security, and the relationship between terrorism and drug traffic. They are interested in both Sunni jihadist groups such as Daesh and Shiite groups such as Hezbollah. Between the two, there is no form of interest in a political Islam such as it is contemplated in Europe or by me. There was not an attempt to consider the possibility of a space opening between the practice of a religion within the framework of religious pluralism and the recourse to violent action. Let's remember that in Europe, issues such as the veil, the halal market, the attacks on secularism, the political entrism of the Muslim Brothers, the support of state powers such as Qatar or Turkey, the separatism and the communitarization, the instrumentalization of themes such as Islamophobia are treated. In other words, in Latin America, as in Europe, there is a space for Islamism, as we know, which would be a way of conceiving Islam not only as a religion, but also as a social, legal, and political code of conduct or way of life. Its first mark would be the refusal to recognize the separation of religion and state, and thus the will to undermine this fundamental principle of democratic and pluralist societies. It is this space of political conquest that is a great absentee of Latin American research, with the exception of a single researcher, a Chilean, who has devoted several works to fundamentalism and the war against the West, as well as to anti-Semitism, but his work is not widely taken up. For him, Islamism refers to a religious movement characterized by the aspiration to solve social and political problems through religion, seeking the foundation of Islamic law to apply them to the realm of politics, culture, and society. An Argentine researcher has worked on Islamic anthropology critically, but it is not the main line of her work. It is one of the few to have been translated into Arabic, however. Here, it refers to an Islamic theoretical space which seeks to Islamize anthropological knowledge by questioning the principle of autonomy between the scientific world and religious imperatives. This theoretical work meets, however, one of the important points of Latin American academic thought, which is often summarized under the title decolonial. In fact, Latin American scholars overwhelmingly criticize the set of separations and distinctions produced by European or Eurocentric thought. The affiliation claimed here is that of Michel Foucault, and the tendency is to assimilate knowledge and power. What is a product of the distinction between religion and politics is often viewed with suspicion. Some thinkers go so far as to find in unidentified Islamism a fellow traveler in their own war against the West. Here, I'm thinking of the famous Argentine-Mexican decolonial philosopher Enrique Dussel, who endorsed a Spanish-Syrian researcher, Sirin Abi Sibay. He is not a specialist in Islam. in the book of Céline Alvi-Sibai about decolonial Islamic feminism in France would not have failed to attract attention for its indictment of the so-called white feminism known as Islamophobic. Islamism is an area in which Latino researchers are not interested, perhaps because of ideological blindness, perhaps because the dangers and stakes do not seem right to them. There are, however, several links between the diffusion of Islam in different countries and the organization of Islam, for example, in the United States, with the group Why Islam, which is a program of the ICNA, an organization that is not far from Islamism, or Islam in Spanish. We should also mention a Californian researcher of Egyptian origin who dedicated her life to publishing her findings and creating a database for all the Islamic or Arabic documents found in Mexico and Latin America. She is active in the California Muslim community as well as in academic circle of the Reflection of Islam in Mexico, but her membership is both activist and academic, and a relationship to Islamism is not questioned. In general, Latino researchers are not very interested in globalist Islam, nor in the possible influences of foreign countries, Islamic groups, or in the politicization of Islam. There is, however, a lot of work to be done, which must be done. The most interesting case here is the famous conversion of the Tzotziles of Chiapas, Mexico, to Islam via a Sufi group, the Murabitun. But researchers in Latin America are here mostly interested in the sociology and history of these oppressed groups that converted, and less in the transnational group that is certainly Islamist and its ideological foundations and goals. In a word, academic research in Latin America returns to the uncritical attitude of a certain anthropology. There are therefore two main trends in research on Islam: a vision that refers to political extremism and sees in every Muslim a potential terrorist danger, and on the other hand, an anthropological vision, often angelic, which takes the opposite view of the other discourse and refuses to see globalist dynamics. Between these two approaches, serious work is often lacking on transnational organizations, on charities, on the progression of halal transnationals, as well as on the circulation of people. Finally, there is also a lack of work on chronology because the religious world is a world in permanent recomposition due to multiple factors. And it is obvious that the transformations taking place in Muslim countries influence local Islam. One could say that academics seem relatively deaf and blind to these transformations. There is not a single article on the end of the Saudi-related organizations, which until at least 5 years ago federated mosques and centers. There is no article on the organizations that have replaced them, and there is not a political article on the links with Islamism in the United States. Yet these links are obvious via American Hispanic Islamic Organization or charitable groups like Helping Hands or the Turkish Humanitarian Relief Foundation. There is not a single article about Chile Halal, a halal trade group that organizes a large trade show in Chile every year and has connection to international halal. There is also no work on the redeployment of the official Turkish officer after the withdrawal of Gulen. In short, a theoretical and field work is to be conducted. In fact, it is as if Islam had to be arrayed in a purely Latin context. What is to say, on the one hand, the desired end of the Christian monopoly in religious matters and religious polarization, and on the other hand, in a context of criticism of the empire. And it is true that many conversions took place in the wake of 11 September for Sunnism and in the case of Shiism, they are conversion often linked to a political commitment to the extreme left, anti-imperialist and pro-Palestinian or anti-Zionist. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Ms. Sylvie, for your fruitful presentation. Our next speaker is Professor Rohan Gunaratna, Professor of Security Studies at the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to congratulate you and the speakers for organizing this event, because I think it's a very timely and a very useful event. Let me say at the very beginning that all religions, including Islam, has been used, misused, and abused. For instance, I'm a Buddhist, but even Buddhism was used by Om Shinrikyo in Japan, and Soko Asahara staged a number of attacks, including using sarin as gas. We also saw the Hindutva groups, a group called RSS. This group assassinated Godse. Godse assassinated leading light of India. And what we have seen is, again, Hinduism was misinterpreted. Then there is the Sikh groups. So we saw that there is a group called Babar Khalsa International. They bombed a plane full of people traveling from Canada to India. Again, the misinterpretation of Sikhism. There is a Jewish group, again, the political interpretation of Judaism called Kahane group. And again, they killed a number of leaders and others using and misusing that religion. We saw many Christian groups also moving in that direction. In Indonesia, for example, there's a group called Laskar Christus, and they have a women's wing called Brigade Kupu Kupu. And this group also used Christianity. They interpreted it in a political context to go and kill. We all saw what happened in New Zealand in March 15th, 2019. Again, they took Christianity to an extreme, Brenton Tarrant, to kill people. So all faiths have been misinterpreted, while all faiths have been brought to earth to bring civilization. But we saw, especially in the last 30 years, these faiths have been misinterpreted and misrepresented, and it has caused untold suffering. Now I want to share with you that from a non-Arab perspective, it is so important to raise awareness in the world that any religion can be misinterpreted. It is not only Islam, but many people in Asia, Africa, Europe, North America believe that there's something wrong with Islam, that Muslims go towards violence. But if you look at all the other religions, these religions also have been used, misused, and abused for political reasons. So I think that there's a huge injustice that has fallen upon Islam and the Muslims, because this aspect has not been corrected. The second point I want to make is that of all religions today, Islam is the faith that has been mostly misused and abused. There was a time where Christianity was used. In the name of Christ, there was more violence committed than all other faiths during the Crusades. But today, 92% of all terrorist attacks are driven by the misinterpretation of Islam or political Islam. So I believe that the Muslim world, the Arab world, and their friends should work together to dispel these myths, but also to correct the misinterpretation of Islam. Let me share with you, having worked in Afghanistan, having worked in Iraq, having worked in Libya on the ground, what the Islamists told me. And I will cite an interview that I did in Afghanistan. A terrorist told me that we have fought the bear. Bear means the Soviets. And we have defeated the bear, meaning the Soviet Union collapsed and it became Russia. Then he said, in Iraq, the American Eagle has crashed. That is when the US forces withdrew from Iraq. So I asked him, what is your next target? And he said, the next target is the dragon. He said that we have defeated one superpower. We have fought another superpower, that is the Americans in Iraq. And the next superpower we are going to fight, the Chinese. So Islamism is a global threat. We should not underestimate it. And that is why it is so important for the world to come together to address the interpretation and the misinterpretation of all faiths, including Islam. Let me share with you a little bit about the three phases of Islamism, the violent phases of Islamism that I have seen. One is the groups that emerged in the 1970s, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, the Islamic group of Egypt, or the Al-Jihad al-Islamiyah and the Al-Gama al-Islamiyah. Then, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, because Muslim Brotherhood was the precursor of the Al-Gama al-Islamiyah and Al-Jihad al-Islamiyah. And all these groups worked together, supported the creation of a group called the Maktab al-Khidamat, or the Afghan Service Bureau that fought against the Soviets, December 1979 until 1990. So this is the first phase of threat that we saw. The second phase of threat was the creation of Al-Qaeda, August 11, 1988, in Peshawar. And Al-Qaeda trained so many groups in Afghanistan, more than 30 groups. And we saw that Al-Qaeda became the second phase of threat. And the third phase of threat is the Islamic State, IS. So, or Dawla Islamiyah. So the threat will continue to evolve. And what is important is that one has to address the main driver of that political violence and terrorism. And the stage that precedes that violence is what you call exclusivism, because exclusivist ideologies lead to extremist ideologies, and the extremist ideologies, when it becomes functional or operational, they become violent. So these are the three phases. So if we move away from pluralism, there is exclusivism, and exclusivism leads to extremism, and extremism leads to violence, and one narrow sliver of that violence is terrorism. Let me conclude by saying that how do we fight this threat? One is that all governments should work to fight Islamism at different levels, even the non-violent forms of Islamism. Because if you politicize societies and cultures and politics, you will never have peace. One of the reasons the Muslim world did not progress in my view, is because of Islamism. If you look at the Muslim societies in history, they have produced the best scientists. Biruni, Ibn Sina, some of the best mathematicians, some of the best geographers, some of the best historians. The West, the civilization came from the Muslim world, but Islamism damaged the Muslim world. So it is so important to understand this threat and work against this threat, not only from a military, law enforcement and intelligence perspective, but from a governance, legal and a political perspective and a strategic communications perspective. If we can do this, I believe that the Muslim world will flourish. And once again, we will see that a restoration of stability in the Muslim world. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. That was truly insightful. I couldn't agree more with you, honestly. Islamist movements are, one of the main factors preventing our Muslim society to progress. I'll move on to our next speaker, Dr. Gillian Kennedy, Lecturer of Politics and International Relations at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom. Please, Dr. Gillian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you for inviting me to this important event. It's always good to discuss, I think, political Islam, but taking political Islam in the context to a non-Arab audience is really interesting because it's so different to when you go into an Arab room where you get much more, I think, almost sometimes more honest views. And this is something I'm going to come back to because honesty is a big part of the debate. So I'm going to just mainly speak about the UK. I am Irish, but I specialise predominantly in looking at the Muslim Brotherhood, looking at the Muslim Brotherhood in the UK, but also the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I did my PhD on the Muslim Brotherhood many years ago during the year when Mohammed Morsi was in power. So the question of why do Western academics sympathise with Islamism is a question I think needs to be looked at from a historic point of view and a contemporary point of view. And that's, it's a long story, but it's a long story that has to be told. From a historic point of view, to answer the question, why do academics look at it with sympathy, is really you need to kind of separate academics. So I'm going to say academics were really British, American, Western, but I'm going to mainly talk about British academics into a left wing, a right wing, and I would kind of more a centered, nuanced approach. The left wing academics, we're going to table them left wing, but it's a bit of a crass term to use, but for this brevity of case, I'm going to just stick with that. Left-wing academics in the UK, and there are left-wing academics who basically, they're in universities, but they're also in activist organizations, are very much influenced by history and contemporary. The historic, real kind of, I suppose, tipping points are a couple that really inform this, I think, a lack of honesty. What it is that you have essentially on the left looking at British foreign policy in a few kind of these flashpoints. One would be, the first one would be the Palestinian mandate. The Palestinian mandate saw that UK foreign policy was mismanaged at certain moments in time. So, for example, we see a kind of an attempt to appease both Palestinians and Israelis in the Jewish community in 1917, and then we see with the Peel Commission, so 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, then the Peel Commission in 1937, and then when the British leave in 1947. In each case, what we see is British foreign policy essentially saying to the Palestinians, oh, we're going to give you a state, but we're also going to give the Israelis a state, but not really given clear indication of how that state's going to be legislated and implemented, and in terms of demographics, how it's going to happen. Now, how does this link to present-day academics sympathising with political Islam? Well, essentially, British foreign policy in Palestine is really a hodgepodge. It's a messed up foreign policy because of the Second World War. Britain is an empire that has to get out fast. Its economy is devastated. It can't afford to administer the Palestinian mandate. And there's also the aftermath of the Holocaust, and all of the images that come out of that means that British foreign policy is really informed by these issues and less about Palestine. Now, because of this, it means that what they do is they push a lot of the Palestinian arguments aside. Previously, we have in 1917, there's much more of an appeasing of the Palestinians. Now, this is really, really important because a lot of the present day, what I would describe as basically apologists within UK academia, who say that that all Islamist groups are non-violent, it's informed by this guilt and by this legacy of British foreign policy in Palestine. Now, the second debacle that links to this, informs many foreign policy circles, is failures in British foreign policy when decolonization occurred. So we see like the Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis sees the British sitting down with the French and the Israelis and essentially making a secret pact to take over the Suez Canal in 1956 in the Sèvres Protocol. Now, again, this is a terrible foreign policy, objectively, whether you're on the right or the left as an academic, but it's so mismanaged and has such a detrimental impact in the sense that it basically bolsters Nasserism and it bolsters Arab nationalism, even though it's a dictatorial ideology and not in any way democratic. What it does is it transforms Gamal Abdel Nasser into this hugely popular nationalist leader because of British mismanagement of foreign policy. And this plays into an analysis of political Islam. Why does this play into an analysis? Because it sees the political Islam and I think UK foreign policy in the Middle East in this kind of binary. You're either on the side of you have sympathy for the Palestinians, or you're on the side of you're supporting terrorists. So there are people they're apologizing for Islamist movements rather than seeing it as more nuanced. But the thing about it is, this is not all of UK academia, and it's certain trends at different times kind of come into fashion. So when you have questions of British identity, so for example, when you have the Enoch Powell River of Blood speech in the 60s, when you have like the rise of the National Front in the 1970s, that's when you'll see a reaction. So you'll see like more left-wing academics will come out and say, oh, the Ayatollah Khomeini is not that bad. It's an Islamic revolution, but the Shah was really bad. Now, it's true, the Shah in Iran was really quite bad. It was a very poor regime. In terms of dissent, there was very little dissent. But that does not mean that Ayatollah Khomeini's regime in Iran was a democratic paradise. But unfortunately, I think sometimes academics in the West and the UK fall into this trap where they're kind of critical of an authoritarian regime on one side, and then they see the other side and say, well, the Islamists are Democrats. When one, I suppose, two rights does not make two wrongs don't make a right, so to speak. So I think this is a problem that a lot of academics fall into in the UK. And then since 9/11, because of UK foreign policy and all of the issues related to how, the dossier here, the way some people would, the war was enacted in an illegal way, and the protests, as that when you have flashpoints in UK foreign policy, they then reflect back into domestic foreign policy, and then academics react to that. So you have at various points, as I say, there was during the 1970s with like the National Front, and then the 1980s where you have the Ayatollah and the fatwa against Salman Rushdie and the Salman Rushdie affair in 89, and then another flashpoint being post 9/11, war on terror, the Iraqi invasion. At these points, we see these outbursts of academics basically apologizing for Islamist movements, where they treat them as this kind of homogenous movement. Oh, they're not violent. We need to understand that, the jihadist is a freedom fighter in the same way the Palestinian is a freedom fighter. And it's not really nuanced at all. And I think that there has been a reaction to that in the last 20 years. I think there's been a lot more nuanced analysis that's come out from a more kind of, I suppose you could say, centrist university analysis, like, for example, Fawaz Gerges, some stuff that I've been writing as well, been looking at the Muslim Brotherhood and recognizing, for example, that their views when it comes to citizenship rights of non-Muslims are fairly abhorrent. I mean, for example, when in interviews, you have conversations with Muslim Brotherhood members who would openly acknowledge that they don't think a Coptic Christian, for example, in Egypt, should be allowed to be to run for president. That's an obvious anti-democratic viewpoint. But if you say this to some left-wing academics in the UK, for example, Asim Qureshi, who's an academic, but he also works for CAGE, who's an activist organization, which are very critical of the war on terror, they will say, well, no, that's racist. What you're doing is you're saying it's racist. It's like, well, no, I'm not being racist. I'm analyzing an Islamist policy in black and white on the page. But the thing is, by saying that the Muslim Brotherhood's views are abhorrent when it comes to the citizenship rights of non-Muslims within a Muslim majority community, that's not saying at the same time that the Muslim Brotherhood are inclined to organize in the same way as Al-Qaeda. I don't think that the Muslim Brotherhood are going to organize terrorist attacks on the West at any point, and they haven't. But there are elements within the organization that are connected to other violent organizations within Egypt, for instance. And that has to be recognized. There has to be some nuance. And so we have this kind of, this ongoing debate that has flashpoints, that we have these outbursts of apologism for political Islamist movements that are violent whenever there is something that occurs, usually in foreign policy, that's reflected. So the latest one in the UK would be academics that are quite critical of the UK's counter-terrorism policy, PREVENT. Now, PREVENT is a policy that's meant to stop the radicalization of predominantly young Muslims, but young people in general. So there's parts of it that are specifically targeting white nationalism and supremacy, but also targeting potential recruits to Islamist jihadist movements. Now, part of this policy has been problematic. Again, much like many UK foreign policy and domestic policies, there are parts of it that have not worked so well. There have been PREVENT practitioners who have been racist and who have made poor judgments. But there also have been PREVENT practitioners who've made good policies and stopped young Muslims from becoming radicalized and joining ISIS. But a lot of British academics, when they look at PREVENT, they're like, no, we should just remove the whole policy. We shouldn't intervene in schools. We should basically allow all young people to practice their faith in whatever form they want. But the reality is there are some schools and there are some mosques in the UK that have been incubators of radical forms of Islamism. So, but the background to this reaction, to this apologism for PREVENT and for violent forms of Islamism is rooted in the scandals during the war on terror that the UK have been involved in, scandals in Afghanistan, Iraq, that are then reflected back into UK domestic policy, and then that's again reflected back through academia. So it's like this vicious circle, and I know I keep repeating my point, but it is true. It's like these flashpoints of foreign policy mismanagement then go back, and then the outpouring comes from the left. And it's really problematic. But I do think that there is hope. I do think that in the last 15 years, for example, from a purely academic standpoint, I think a lot of Middle Eastern politics used to be purely organized around Middle Eastern studies departments in the UK. And I think now in the last few years, they've really been focused on moving over into political science and international relations departments. And I think that's really, really important because it's taken it from its little nuanced, small kind of pockets of left-wing apologism for political Islam and moving it to the more center ground where academics now are looking at Islamist movements through comparative processes to analyze both its ideological construction, but its approach to non-Muslims, to women, to foreign policy, to even to taxation, to the environment. When you look at groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, it's seeing that there are younger elements of the Brotherhood that have branched off in recent years and that are really against the leadership and have been trying to build a new form of the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think things are changing and I've got hope in that. And I don't know if I went past my time, so I'm going to stop now on a moment. So I hope that was okay. And thank you for your time. And thank you for inviting me to speak today.
Of course, thank you so much, Dr. Gillen. That was truly informative and insightful. Our final speaker is Lorenzo Vidino, Director of the Program on Extremism at George Washington University in the United States.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to all the other speakers. It's a very interesting and thought-provoking topic when we're discussing today. And I've heard a lot of very interesting points in a way more intellectually honest than what you normally hear. And I think it's remarkable and telling that it's an Arab-based think tank think tank that organizes a topic like this. And I think it's very telling of the level of the debate or lack thereof in the West. I will speak mostly about the US. That's the country where I've been practicing for the last 20 years on and off. And I think we all agree that the debates change from country to country. I really appreciate seeing how the debate ranges in different European countries, in South America. The US is very particular. It has arguably, and that is no offense to the other countries, the biggest policy relevance when it comes to the Middle East, because Middle East studies in the States shape American policymakers, shape the debate in the States. And there's no other country in the West that has an impact on the Middle East bigger than the US. So what happens in the American academic and think tank debate in the US is crucially important then for policy globally in the Middle East. And I think the general point I will make is that it's an analysis very similar to what Dr. Kennedy described for the UK, a general approach of sympathetic views when it comes to academia, now with a lot of exceptions, a lot of caveats, a lot of ifs and buts, a lot of degrees of intensity, of different levels of intellectual honesty. And of course, it's very difficult to empirically assess. But I think any intellectually honest observer would agree that, generally speaking, the debate in the US is fairly sympathetic in the academic world to Islamist viewpoints. I would argue more than in most European countries. I spend half of my time in European countries, and the one thing where I don't see a similarity between the US and the UK in Dr. Kennedy's analysis was the optimism that she had for the UK for the last 10, 15 years, where there's been an improvement in the level of debate in the UK. And I agree with that. Observing the UK scene, I tend to agree with that. I don't see it in the US. So that's where the only place of my analysis of the US would differ from hers on the UK. Now, trying to breaking it down as to why that is, what leads to this general sympathy for Islamists in the US academic debate, I would say there's three overlapping factors. The first one being the most important is the genuine ideological sympathy that exists within most academic communities in the US, for the very same reason that Dr. Kennedy outlined. Sort of a generally progressive milieu. There are polls that indicate that between 85 to 95% of academics in the US in social sciences and humanities identify as either progressive or very progressive. And generally speaking, there has been this idea of sympathizing with ideologies that are anti-Western, anti-United States, and anti-Israel. That has to do with a general view of the progressive movement over the last few decades. It has a very specific American position when it comes to Middle Eastern studies. Contemporary Middle Eastern studies in the US were really created after World War II, once America decided to end its golden isolation and be more involved in the Middle East. And it was really, the field was created largely by the CIA, by the government, that decided that it needed scholars to study the Middle East. So together with the support that was coming from the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundations, but really spearheaded by the CIA, created a network of scholars that were to produce studies that informed, provided a better understanding to US policymakers of the Middle East. That changed substantially in the 1970s as sort of the new left movement became very prominent on US campuses, as there was a backlash due to a variety of foreign policy issues in the US, some of them related to the Middle East, Palestine being a big one, but also Vietnam. A variety of issues really led to academia shunning this close proximity to the CIA, to government, almost being embarrassed by those connections, and taking a very different approach, very anti-US, anti-Western, and supporting ideologies that were anti-Western. Now, we can find the moment where really everything shifted in 1978 with the publication of Orientalism by Edward Said. Said's book really shapes then the following generation of Middle Eastern scholars. It really becomes the book that is revered by most scholars in academia. And if you see the people that then came to run departments in the most prominent universities that deal with the Middle East in the US, the Middle East Studies Association, MESA, the very powerful sort of organization of scholars of the Middle East. The vast majority of them are Saidians, people who embrace Edward Said's viewpoint, that embrace post-colonial theory and the general approach that Said laid out in Orientalism. Now, I would argue that most of the scholars, starting with Said's time, and still today, are not Islamists themselves, are not necessarily pro-Islamists. They tend to be very sympathetic to Arab nationalism for the most part. It might be a generational thing, and I'm not arguing that now it's pro-Islamist. But I think they have a general viewpoint of excusing any ideology that is against the West and always blaming as a reflex the West. But probably their sympathy is not directly, for the most part, with Islamism. It is still with any ideology that is against the West. And how does that translate in practical terms? Well, it translates into this narrative of painting Islamist groups like the Brotherhood as Democrats, making this comparison with the Christian Democrats of Germany or Italy, and sort of this whitewashing of the social and political agenda of Islamists. And when it comes to the violent side of the equation, to jihadists, until 9/11, the approach was ignoring it, simply not devoting any substantial work to it, just pretending it didn't exist. You don't find any single academic work, scholarly work on Al-Qaeda or similar groups that predates 9/11. Now, of course, after 9/11, it becomes impossible to do so and to deny the importance of these groups. But it's, of course, a sort of a whitewashing, whataboutism, relativization of the phenomenon. So I would say that this sort of genuine sympathy with Islamism as an ideology, as an anti-Western post-colonial ideology, is the first and main factors. But I would say there are two more that are, to some degree, quite specifically American, although probably visible in other countries, but fairly prominent in the US. And the second would be the very large influx of foreign funding. The fact that a variety of donors from most of the Arab Gulf, not all of them, but quite a few of them with Islamist sympathies, have funneled tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into the US academic system, and of course, privileging academics that support their worldview. The third and final factor is the fact that Islamist actors have themselves become active in the academic space. Exactly like Dr. Kennedy was talking about Cage and some elements within Cage or sympathetic to the Cage worldview in the UK have entered the UK academic system. The same thing applies to the US, but it actually predates that. An entity like IIIT, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, created by Yusuf al-Qaradawi in the late 70s and by some of the godfathers of the Muslim Brotherhood in the West in the late 1970s, and has really become a very powerful institution that funds research, endows chairs, provides a variety of forms of support to academics that, of course, adopt views that are friendly, if not entirely supportive of Islamist viewpoints. And IIIT has very close relationship with some of the most important universities in the Washington area, and really creating sort of a hub in the seat of power in DC. Now, again, a lot of exceptions. That is not to say that the debate is entirely dominated, but I would say that's definitely a prominent view, and it becomes a circle that is quite difficult to break for any junior academic, any young scholar, to take a position that is strongly against the main narrative of sympathy for Islamist sort of anti-Western approach. It's really not a smart career move when it comes to then the ability to obtain a permanent position, a faculty position, or to obtain grants, or to just be friendly with your colleagues it's not a smart move. And so this sort of perpetuates this dynamic in which those that have the leverages of power of American academia of the Middle East have these views, and it's difficult to break. I think the last trend that we see now, exactly like we see, Dr. Kennedy was mentioning the anti-prevent agenda in the UK, where we see this sort of academization of Islamism, where views that are, they're not very sound academically, are given this facade of scholarly analysis to frame what is quintessential and ideological position, not really backed by facts. We see the same thing with the issue of Islamophobia in the US and in any other Western countries. But it's not to say, of course, that anti-Muslim sentiments don't exist. They, of course, sadly exist. They manifest themselves in all different ways, whether it's discourse, even in fairly mainstream quarters, or in violent acts. That's undeniable that it exists. But what we are seeing is a different thing. It's the weaponization, the exaggeration of Islamophobia by individuals that might hold an academic position here and there, might be in some think tank, quite a few of them backed by Turkey and Qatar financially, and having this pseudo-academic discourse that seeks to weaponize, exaggerate Islamophobia, clearly to silence any kind of debate on Islamism. And this is, again, a very American trend, but we see it in every Western country. Let me conclude by saying that the one silver lining here is the think tank community. And I would argue that, of course, in a place like the States, that the think tank community is very influential, very big community. And the debate, I would say, in the think tank community in Washington is significantly more nuanced than what it is in the academic sphere. It's not the opposite of the academic. It's not that academia is pro-Islamist and think tanks are anti-Islamist. I think the think tank community, again, I'm simplifying things a bit, but it reflects a variety of opinions, as it should, as also the academic world should. You'll find places that are fairly pro-Islamist. You'll find equally influential think tanks that are fairly anti-Islamist, and again, with different level of nuance and with different sort of political orientations. So the discourse at the think tank level is better. And that leads to the question, of course, of who shapes the debate? Who do policymakers listen to? The first reflex answer is nobody. There's a lot of jokes going around about how think tankers and academics talk and policymakers don't listen to that. But I would say, of course, by virtue of their proximity to government, think tanks tend to have more the ear of policymakers for the most part. And I think that is probably the one positive aspect that I see about the debate on Islamism. Having said so, we see in many European countries a fairly heated debate on Islamism. In most of the countries we discussed today, in France in particular, in the UK, in Germany, probably to a lesser degree, we see quite a bit of a discourse on Islamism, both the domestic aspect of it and the foreign aspect of it. We don't really see that in the US for a variety of reasons, and I'm mindful of the fact that I'm running out of time. There's little of the very intense debate on Islamism that exists in most European countries in the US. It's just not a major issue now. It was a few years ago. It no longer is, particularly when it comes to domestic Islamism. It's really a known issue on the public debate. I can leave it at that. Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you, Lorenzo, for your fruitful presentation. It's always good to have you here joining us at Trans. I'll be moving on to an open discussion. I had a few questions for our speakers, but unfortunately, due to time, I'll be asking one general question to give space for our speakers, to answer and conclude. So relating to the title of the e-forum, how can we promote dialogue between Western and Arab academia to find a common ground regarding Islamist movements? So anyone wants to go?
I believe that there should be a greater discussion and debate on this issue. And there can be platforms that will bring both these categories of scholars together. For instance, you had an event dedicated for Arab scholars, and today you have an event dedicated for non-Arab scholars. So I would ask you to create a third event where you will bring scholars from both these streams to work together on common issues, on common challenges. So you can have a session where specific topics are given, specific challenges are given to an Arab scholar and a non-Arab scholar to provide their own perspectives, so that there will be at least some resolution on some aspects of those issues. That is just one idea, but there could be many more ways of doing it. But thank you for your question.
If I might very quickly.
Sorry, you go.
Oh, sorry, Dr.
No, you go. You had your hand up first.
I'll be very quick, sorry. Piggybacking on what Rohan said, there's plenty of things that can be done. What he suggested is a fantastic idea. That's sort of short term. In the longer term, I think, and that's something we have discussed with Trends on other occasions, the idea of visiting fellowships, of course, both ways, with scholars spending substantial time, not just visiting for a couple of days, but I'm talking months, sabbatical, entire year in Western universities, in Western capitals. Another thing that, of course, Trends does quite a bit is translating works in Arabic to English, and I guess also French, German, and other Western countries, and trying to really disseminate those products as much as possible. There's a wealth of expertise, of understanding on Islamism in Arabic. The level of the conversation in Arabic, it's light years ahead when it comes to Islamism, or where it is for the most part in the West, but that experience, that wealth of knowledge is lost to the majority of people in the West, including in academia. So I think some of the things that Trends have been doing, I think, are quite good on that front.
Dr. Gillen?
Well, I was going to say translation too. I think you've got a really, really good point there, Lorenzo. I think that it would be really informative for Western academics to actually see policy platforms, for example, by Islamist movements translated. I think more often than not, we kind of get like a basic shopping list, and it's not really the detailed analysis that we need. But I think another one would be, I think a lot of academic conferences have a tendency to, when we have a discussion, it has like a top line of we're just going to do Islamist movements. And I think that we would get much more, we pushed Western academics to be much more nuanced in an analysis of political Islamist movements if we broke it down to specifics. So if it was just looking at basically Islamist movements' position on tax redistribution or tax reform, or if it was just looking at on Islamist movements' position on citizenship rights in relation to political power, I think that we're presenting catch-all conferences that increase these kind of more vague polemical insights on Islamist movements. And I think if we were much more comprehensive and more detailed in how we present the conferences, then we would get more detailed analysis as a response to it. That's just my thoughts on it.
Thank you, Dr. Gillen. Any other concluding remarks or suggestions? Go ahead.
Perhaps, yes, thank you. Perhaps very, very shortly, I would like just to join my colleague from Singapore and, of course, Lorenzo and others with regard to this idea of dialogue. And I can just tell you that from my own experience, I can give you an example in Germany. During a conference in 2012 about Islamism in power. I mean, at that time with Morsi was the president in Egypt, and of course the Islamist party An-Nahda in Tunisia. And it was like a revelation, because between romanticizing Islam and demonizing Islam, we can see that we can really deal with a lot of taboos perhaps, and also we can clarify a lot of misunderstanding. And of course, the critique of Islamism was something during this conference, something very hard for the colleagues from Egypt and Tunisia, defending rather, how shall I say, an Islamism which is not progressive, let's to say in this term, with regard to for example equality between men and women, with regard to non-Muslim communities and so on. So this kind of encounters are very important. They are not easy, not always easy, but I think this is really the best way in order to yes, to see things differently, and sometimes to displace perspectives on also from both sides. I mean the Arabic and the non-Arabic academias. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'll conclude the session. On behalf of Trans Research and Advisory, I'd like to thank our speakers for their distinguished perspectives, and the viewers who have joined us today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.